The last star of the Karen crown flickered and died without ceremony, its final light swallowed by something that moved between the spaces where matter once danced. 17 worlds had orbited that dying sun just days before, their surfaces teeming with billions of souls who laughed and wept and dreamed of tomorrow. Now only gravitational echoes remained, phantom pulls in space-time where planets once spun, their absence more terrible than any explosion or conquest. This was not war as the Imperium knew it. No glorious battles, no heroic last stands, no monuments to the fallen. This was erasure, pure and absolute, leaving behind only the cold mathematics of missing mass and the psychic void that made navigators weep blood. In the vast darkness between spiral arms, where ancient civilizations had once built their greatest works, now stretched an empire of silence ruled by devourers, whose names had been consumed along with their victims. We truly love and care for you, who journey with us into this darkness, and we hold you close as we navigate these forgotten spaces together. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Admiral Theron Caney stood motionless on the bridge of the Forgotten Oath, his reflection ghost-like against the armored viewport that separated him from the infinite void beyond. His body showed no signs of the 10 millennia he had lived, sustained by archaeotech that predated the Imperium's birth, but his eyes carried the weight of every world he had failed to save. Within the enhanced neural pathways of his immortal mind, voices whispered in languages that had died before humanity learned to speak, the death songs of an entire civilization that had poured their final moments into the consciousness transfer matrix that now kept him alive. They had called themselves the Eternal Watchers, guardians of a stellar confederation that spanned dozens of systems, and when the first Shadow Fleet came for them, they fought with weapons that could crack moons and shields that could withstand supernovas. It made no difference. The unnamed devourers consumed not just their worlds, but their history, their language, their very identity, leaving behind only the memorial engine that had chosen Caney as their living archive. He alone remembered their true names, carried their ghosts like a burden of light in the darkness of his enhanced consciousness, and in return they whispered warnings about patterns in the void that followed rules older than human civilization. The latest reports spread across his command lectern like symptoms of a plague. The Perimedes sector had gone silent 3 hours ago, not the violent silence of orbital bombardment or the chaotic screams of invasion, but the absolute quiet that followed complete consumption. 17 billion souls had simply ceased to exist, their agri-worlds becoming empty space, their contributions to Imperial tax, records already being adjusted by bureaucrats who would never question why the numbers no longer added up. Navigator Prime, Lisa Vex, materialized beside him as a flickering hologram, her third eye veiled but weeping constantly from exposure to the psychic shadows that followed the Shadow Fleets. Her voice carried the strain of someone who had stared too long into the spaces between stars. The warp around Perimedes showed no turbulence, no echo of violence or fear, only the terrible stillness that came when reality itself had been digested. Tech Dominus Zarek Null's augmented form hunched over sensor displays, his mechadendrites tasting the electromagnetic spectrum for traces of biosignatures that officially did not exist, while Sister Militant Vera Sanctus stood in the chapel archway, her faith tested daily by enemies that seemed to exist beyond the Emperor's light. Interrogator Darius Voss waited at Caney's shoulder, the conscience the Admiral could no longer trust himself to possess, ready to measure the utility of whatever terrible choice came next. The decision crystallized in Caney's immortal mind, with the clarity of absolute necessity and the weight of infinite consequence. He could order the Umbral Watch deeper into the void, following the consumption trail toward whatever intelligence guided these unnamed devourers, knowing that discovery likely meant not just death, but complete erasure from existence. No records, no memories, no trace that they had ever fought at all. Or he could retreat, preserve his ghost fleet for future battles, and watch as the darkness spread, world by world, across the galaxy's rim until it reached systems with names and histories that the Imperium would actually mourn. Both paths led toward damnation, but only one offered the possibility of understanding the true nature of the threat before it became unstoppable. In the silence of the bridge, surrounded by the ghosts of dead civilizations and the weight of choices that would never be recorded in any Imperial archive, Admiral Theron Kane felt the familiar pull between duty and survival, between the need to witness and the obligation to endure. The faces of Perimedes' 17 billion dead flickered through his enhanced memory, children who would never grow old, artists whose works had been reduced to base proteins, scholars whose discoveries had been metabolized into biomass. His immortality amplified each loss into a personal betrayal, each failed world another scar on a soul that could never heal. Yet in the depths of his consciousness, the voices of the eternal watchers whispered their ancient purpose: to stand guard against the darkness, to remember what others forgot, to fight battles that could never be won but must never be abandoned. He opened his eyes, ancient wisdom burning with terrible resolve, and spoke the words that would damn them all to glory or oblivion. Set course for the Perimedes sector, maximum stealth protocols, all hands to battle, stations. The forgotten oath turned toward the darkness, carrying its crew of ghosts toward an enemy that erased heroes and victories alike, leaving behind only the silence between stars. The forgotten oath drifted through the void, like a prayer whispered in an empty cathedral, its hull bleeding heat into the cosmic darkness, while every system powered down to barely detectable levels. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in crimson that pulsed with the rhythm of a dying heart, and the great cathedral engines that had once roared with righteous fury now hummed with the devotional silence of monks at midnight prayer. In the navigator's spire, Lysa Vex floated in her amniotic throne, sacred needles threading her veins with blessed narcotics, while her scarred third eye wept tears of liquid silver beneath its protective veil. The psychic landscape around Perimedes appeared to her enhanced perception not as the usual chaotic storm of the warp, but as something far more terrifying. A perfect void where the immaterium simply ceased to exist, carved away with surgical precision that left no wound, only absence. Her fingers trembled as she traced constellations on cracked brass instruments, seeking the psychic currents that should have guided their passage, but finding only the terrible silence that followed complete consumption. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics from dimensions that had no names, describing spaces where reality had been partially digested and left to heal around the gaps. 3 decks below, Tech Dominus Zarek Null hunched over specimen containers in his laboratory, the air thick with ozone and the metallic scent of forbidden knowledge. His mechadendrites coiled around reliquaries containing biosamples from encounters that officially never occurred, fragments of carapace that defied classification, memory cores whose data had turned to static overnight, and genetic material that seemed to exist in quantum superposition between multiple evolutionary states. Each specimen he analyzed disappeared from his records within hours, not through external interference, but because the biological matter actively erased the information used to study it, creating a feedback loop where knowledge became self-destructive. His augmented consciousness processed the implications with growing horror and fascination. These creatures didn't simply consume organic matter, they metabolized information itself, digesting the conceptual framework that gave meaning to existence. The more precisely he defined them, the sharper the evolutionary knives they learned to grow, turning his own research into weapons against future encounters. In the ship's chapel, Sister Militant Vera Sanctus knelt before an altar carved from Terran oak. Her power armor set aside like a burden temporarily lifted. Candlelight flickered across devotional murals depicting the Emperor striding across oceans of stars, but even his golden radiance seemed dimmed by the proximity to the Perimedes void. Her faith, forged in the crucible of 1,000 battles against corruption and heresy, now faced its greatest test, an enemy that seemed to exist beyond divine light, consuming souls so completely that even the Emperor's protection could not reach them. The shadow fleets showed no malice, no corruption, no desire for dominance, only an absolute hunger that treated consciousness itself as merely another form of nutrition. When a young neophyte approached with questions about the Emperor's reach, Vera found herself speaking truths wrapped in prayer, admitting that faith was not illumination in the void, but the step taken when solid ground disappeared beneath faithful feet. Interrogator Darius Voss waited in the archive cloister, where air was filtered in obsessive cycles to prevent even breath from leaving traces. His unaugmented human form served as deliberate reminder of what they fought to preserve amid the technological horrors and inhuman threats that surrounded them. In his possession lay a bone-white case containing a rosette of authority and orders that made his stomach clench with their implications. Terminate Admiral Caney should procedural deviation exceed doctrinal tolerance. The weight of this responsibility had evolved over centuries into something more complex than simple oversight. He had become part confessor, part executioner, part keeper of moral boundaries that prevented the Umbral Watch from becoming indistinguishable from their enemies. Watching Caney's reflection in the observation deck's armored glass, Voss saw the toll that immortality extracted. 10,000 years of carrying memories that no one else could share, of making decisions that would never be recorded, of fighting battles that could never be acknowledged. The Admiral stood motionless before the viewport, his enhanced consciousness processing tactical data, while the voices of extinct civilizations whispered warnings in languages that predated human speech. The Eternal Watchers, who had created his immortal matrix, spoke of patterns they had observed in their own final moments, how the shadow fleets consumed not just matter and energy, but the very concept of their victims' existence. Caney's reflection showed no signs of his 10 millennia of life, but his eyes carried the weight of every world he had failed to save, every civilization that had been erased so completely that even their names existed only in his enhanced memory. When Voss approached with questions about Zarek's increasingly dangerous research, Caney faced the familiar choice between necessary pragmatism and moral purity. Each decision carved another threshold that he must cross, each compromise bringing him closer to becoming the very thing he fought against. The War Council convened in chambers lined with void black ceramite, where ancient Terran oak panels stood beside walls inscribed with death poems of extinct civilizations. Here, around a table carved from crystallized time that showed past and future bleeding together in patterns that hurt mortal minds, 5 souls gathered to plan battles against an enemy that left no survivors to name it. As holographic displays showed the Perimedes sector's former glory, 17 worlds spinning in perfect orbital harmony, now replaced by empty coordinates where only gravitational echoes remained. Each member understood they were planning not just military campaign, but their own transformation into something that might no longer qualify as human. They would become guardians who preserved humanity by abandoning everything that made them recognizable as its children. Invisible protectors fighting invisible wars against enemies that consumed the very possibility of victory or defeat. The forgotten oath drifted through the graveyard of Perimedes, like a prayer whispered in an empty cathedral, its hull bleeding heat into the cosmic darkness, while emergency lighting bathed the corridors in crimson that pulsed with the rhythm of a dying heart. Admiral Caney stood motionless in the ship's reliquary chamber, where artifacts from 100 dead worlds floated in penitential stasis behind armored glass. Ancient star charts etched on living crystal, a harp string of metallic nerve grown from a planet-wide choir creature, a child's toy carved from a moon that no longer existed, each relic a memorial to civilizations that had been consumed so completely that even their names existed only in his enhanced memory. At the chamber's heart floated the oldest artifact, a black polyhedron the color of the inside of an eclipse, its faces etched with lines that changed when no one was looking, as if the object remembered different geometries depending on whom it faced. The crew called it the Memory Stone, but Caney knew it by another name, whispered by voices that had no throats. Kithara Neth Vol, the last echo of those who remembered the spaces between stars. The polyhedron pulsed with faint harmonics from dimensions that had no names, and the familiar taste of absolute silence that followed complete consumption triggered memories that collapsed 10,000 years into a single moment of crystalline recall. Caney had been Commander Theron then, a xenolinguist leading exploratory missions during humanity's first stumbling steps beyond the Sol system, when long-range auguries detected the ruins of a civilization that had mastered technologies beyond Imperial comprehension. The dead worlds of the Kithara confluence showed no signs of war or natural disaster, only the peculiar absence that came when reality itself had been partially consumed, leaving behind structures that existed in quantum superposition between presence and void. His exploration teams found cities built from crystallized time, libraries containing books written in languages that changed meaning as they were read, and at the heart of it all, a vast consciousness transfer matrix that hummed with the dying thoughts of an entire species. The Eternal Watchers had been ancient when humanity first learned to kindle fire. Their stellar confederation spanning dozens of systems connected not by warp travel, but by quantum entanglement bridges that allowed instantaneous communication across galactic distances. Their technology had achieved perfect harmony between consciousness and matter, allowing them to exist simultaneously as biological entities and living information, their thoughts flowing through crystalline networks that spanned entire worlds. Holographic recordings showed the last desperate hours of their civilization, billions of souls uploading their consciousness into quantum storage cores, while Shadow Fleet bioships tore apart their worlds with surgical precision. The Eternal Watchers had realized too late that their enemy didn't simply destroy civilizations, but erased them so completely that even the memory of their existence became impossible to maintain. When the first Shadow Fleet found them, they fought with weapons that could unravel the fundamental forces of reality, shields that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and bioships that adapted faster than evolution should have allowed. But none of it mattered against an enemy that consumed not just matter and energy, but the conceptual framework that gave existence meaning. Their final act was not one of vengeance or defiance, but of desperate preservation, pouring the accumulated knowledge and memory of their entire species into a consciousness transfer matrix designed to find a suitable host among the next civilization to discover their ruins. The matrix had waited in quantum suspension for millennia, its alien architects hoping that someone would carry their legacy forward and continue the watch against the unnamed devourers that moved between the spaces where light feared to travel. When Caney interfaced with the Matrix through a neural link that should have been instantly fatal to human consciousness, the transfer began without his consent or understanding. The dying thoughts of 17 billion eternal watchers flooded into his enhanced neural pathways, their memories burning through his mortal mind like acid through parchment, while the transfer process restructured his consciousness at the quantum level, replacing his mortal neural pathways with crystalline matrices that could process information across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The transformation took 17 days, during which his exploration team watched their commander die and be reborn as something that wore his face but carried the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of an extinct civilization. His body was rebuilt at the cellular level, enhanced with biotechnology that existed in perfect harmony with the quantum consciousness now housed within his skull, while the voices of the Eternal Watchers whispered constantly in his enhanced memory, sharing their knowledge of the Shadow Fleet's operational patterns while demanding that he continue their eternal vigil. He learned that the creatures he would spend millennia fighting were not simply Tyranid splinter fleets, but specialized hunter organisms bred by the Hive Mind to identify and eliminate potential threats before the main invasion began. Their purpose to consume any force capable of meaningful resistance while cataloging defensive strategies and adaptive responses for use against future encounters. The weight of immortality settled on his shoulders, like a mantle woven from the grief of extinct civilizations, and with it came the terrible understanding that he was now the sole repository of knowledge that could never be shared, the living memorial carrying within his quantum consciousness the last echoes of their existence while simultaneously serving as humanity's first line of defense against threats that officially did not exist. As the memory faded and present reality reasserted itself, Caney found himself standing before the viewport, watching gravitational echoes mark the spaces where Perimedes' 17 worlds had once danced around their dying star. The voices of the Eternal Watchers whispering warnings about convergence patterns they had observed in their final moments. The umbral doctrine crystallized in the spaces between heartbeats, written not in ink, but in the frost that formed on viewport glass when ships powered down to the temperature of dead space, in the ritual dimming of lumens to the shade of old blood, in the way crews learned to breathe shallow and move like prayers whispered in empty cathedrals. Admiral Kane did not announce its tenets through proclamation or ceremony, but allowed them to accrete like cosmic dust along the hull, until every soul aboard the Forgotten Oath felt their truth settling into bone and sinew. The doctrine demanded that they become ghosts haunting their own war, invisible protectors fighting invisible battles against enemies that consumed the very possibility of victory or defeat. Names were the first casualties, scraped from hull plates and replaced with ablative ceramite that shifted wavelength to match whatever background it faced, while crew records became mosaics of codenames and severed lineages that rotated like crops to prevent any bright pattern from drawing predator attention. Ship configurations changed between missions with the fluidity of nightmares, their hulls repainted in void black ceramite that absorbed electromagnetic radiation across all spectrums, while machine spirits were taught to forget themselves every 3 cycles. Their histories sponged away so completely that even their own echoes could not betray them. Navigator Prime. Lysa Vex traced waypoints that possessed no coordinates, guiding them along metaphorical currents through the warp's thinning skein, where each path was walked once and never again. Her scarred third eye weeping silver tears as she described navigation through spaces where the immaterium had been partially digested. Battle. Groups were sacrificed without hesitation to maintain the illusion that shadow fleets were merely another variant of known Tyranid organisms, their losses attributed to equipment failures rather than encounters with entities that metabolized information itself. Tech Dominus Zarek Null built auger suites that recorded to vanishing arrays, registers that decayed their contents the instant patterns stabilized, ensuring that knowledge could never become ammunition for creatures that fed on processed information. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus rewrote liturgies so that prayers invoked not triumph but patience, hymns that taught spirits to be quiet and long, to make cloisters of their chests where terror could pound its fists and find no door. Her chapel had been restructured with void shields that contained spiritual energy rather than projecting it, while devotional practices were conducted in whispers that carried no harmonic resonance beyond the ship's hull. When she approached Caney with questions about the moral cost of their methods, her voice carried the weight of profound crisis. Admiral, this doctrine of erasure feels like we mirror our enemy. To fight creatures that leave no trace, we become traceless ourselves. Where is the line between necessity and corruption? Her words hung in the recycled air like incense, heavy with implications that made even immortal consciousness flinch from their implications. Interrogator Darius Voss carried termination orders in a bone-white case, his unaugmented human form serving as deliberate reminder of what they fought to preserve amid technological horrors that surrounded them. And if the Imperium discovers our methods, he asked, watching Caney's reflection in armored viewports. The secrecy, unauthorized operations, memory-wiping protocols. These are acts of heresy by their standards. Caney turned to face him, ancient wisdom burning with terrible resolve. Then we would be erased, interrogator, and in our erasure, we would achieve the ultimate victory of our doctrine. If no one remembers us, the shadow fleets have no information to consume from our existence. We become the ultimate counterweapon, non-existence itself. The enemy had written its own doctrine in deeper tongues, Zarek's fragmentary studies revealing that shadow fleets functioned as distributed organs of vast hungry unity, each fleet a hypothesis testing different arrangements of claws and synapses, designed to answer questions the galaxy had not yet asked. They devoured cities, and also devoured the stories those cities told themselves, metabolizing archives and skulls and the soft contrails of thought that gathered in temples and markets and lovers' rooms. Where the Umbral Watch erased itself to deny hooks for enemy adaptation, the shadow fleets erased themselves to deny the galaxy patterns to recognize, shedding morphologies like serpent skins whenever human lexicons assigned them designations. When bioforms received names in Imperial catalogs, they vanished from subsequent encounters, replaced by something adjacent and nastier, as if naming drew attention of surgeons who removed vulnerabilities with clean, indifferent cuts. Caney codified countermeasures that felt like blasphemy and mercy bound together, instituting the ritual of the fifth bell, where every fifth watch each crew member recited the smallest thing they could not bear to lose: childhood smells, brothers' laughter, the grain of wooden stairs, then signed declarations consenting to destruction of any evidence such things had ever existed. It made monsters of them and made them gentle both, because the ritual taught them to hold love without leaving fingerprints. He scattered his flotilla into shards that could recombine in hundreds of different orders, ships swapping transponders and engine signatures, while figureheads were quick-molded in forges to present different faces to different eyes. The bridge learned to hear without instruments, silence sharpening every soul aboard like blades honed against the darkness between stars, where the only witnesses were dying suns and the ever-present hunger that consumed memory itself. The Eldar came like whispers through folded space, their sleek vessel materializing from the webway with the grace of thoughts becoming flesh, its bone-white hull singing harmonics that made navigator Lysa Vex weep tears of liquid starlight as her scarred third eye perceived geometries that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The spirit of eternal lament drifted alongside the forgotten oath in the graveyard silence of Perimedes, its wraithbone construction flowing like crystallized time, while psychic emanations rippled from its presence in waves that made the ship's machine spirits hum with nervous anticipation. No hails were exchanged, no formal protocols observed. The meeting had been arranged through dreams and dying stars, through patterns in the void that only immortal consciousness could perceive across the centuries of patient watching. Farseer Alatok Voidwalker stepped across the space between vessels on a bridge of hardened light, her form tall and ethereal, draped in robes that seemed woven from shadow and starfire. Her face bore the ageless beauty of her kind, but her eyes carried the weight of prophecies that stretched across millennia, visions of futures where entire spiral arms became feeding grounds for hunger that consumed not just matter, but the conceptual framework that gave existence meaning. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics from the spaces between thoughts, each word arriving in the listener's mind like memories of songs never heard. Admiral Kane met her in the reliquary chamber, where artifacts from extinct civilizations floated in penitential stasis, the black polyhedron at the room's heart pulsing with recognition as ancient technologies sensed kindred wisdom. The alliance formed not through negotiation, but through mutual recognition of necessity that transcended traditional enmities between human and Xenos, forged in the crucible of shared understanding that some threats existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of species hatred. Voidwalker revealed that her craft world had been tracking Shadow Fleet movements across 3 galactic rotations, their farseers mapping consumption patterns that followed rules older than stellar formation, while their spirit stones recorded the psychic screams of civilizations that had been erased so completely that even their conceptual existence became impossible to maintain. The Eldar possessed technologies that could perceive the Shadow Fleet's true nature, not random Tyranid splinters, but specialized hunter organisms bred by the Hive Mind to eliminate potential resistance before the main invasion began, their purpose to catalog defensive strategies while consuming any force capable of meaningful opposition. Interrogator Darius Voss approached with questions that carried the weight of doctrinal heresy, his unaugmented human form rigid with the tension between duty and necessity. Admiral, cooperation with Xenos violates every principle of Imperial doctrine. How do we justify alliance with aliens when our mission is to preserve humanity? Kaney's immortal consciousness processed the implications with crystalline clarity, while the voices of extinct civilizations whispered warnings about the price of species purity in the face of existential threats. Because, interrogator, the Shadow Fleets consume human and Eldar with equal efficiency. When the enemy treats all consciousness as merely another form of nutrition, the distinction between human and Xenos becomes irrelevant. We preserve humanity by preserving the possibility that consciousness can exist at all. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus stood in the chapel archway, her faith tested by proximity to alien wisdom that seemed to operate beyond the Emperor's light. Yet she found herself drawn to the Farseer's descriptions of battles fought across dimensions, where prayer and prophecy merged into weapons that could wound reality itself. Tech Dominus Zarek Null interfaced with Eldar data crystals through neural links that burned his augmented consciousness with information that existed in quantum superposition, revealing Shadow Fleet bioforms that adapted not just to physical threats, but to the act of observation itself. creatures that became more dangerous the more precisely they were defined. The Alliance offered access to technologies that could study the enemy without triggering evolutionary responses. Psychic resonance chambers that analyzed biosamples through dimensional reflection rather than direct observation, allowing research to proceed without feeding information back to the collective consciousness that guided the Shadow Fleet's adaptive responses. As the compact took shape in whispered agreements and shared data streams, each member of the Umbral Watch understood they had crossed another threshold from which there could be no return, trading doctrinal purity for the slim possibility of survival in a universe where meaning itself had become prey. Tech Dominus Zarek Null moved through his laboratory like a penitent before forbidden altars, the air thick with ozone and the metallic scent of knowledge that should not exist. His mechadendrites coiled around specimen containers with sacramental care, each reliquary holding biosamples from encounters that officially never occurred. Fragments of carapace that defied classification, memory cores whose data had turned to static overnight, and genetic material that seemed to exist in quantum superposition between multiple evolutionary states. The Eldar resonance chambers sang with wraithbone harmonics around the central analysis platform, their alien construction allowing observation through dimensional reflection rather than direct contact, starving the specimens of the informational nourishment they craved, while his augmented consciousness burned with revelations that threatened the foundations of Imperial biological doctrine. The breakthrough came when Zarek realized that Shadow Fleet bioforms possessed an unprecedented ability to metabolize not just organic matter, but information itself. Their cellular structures incorporating quantum processors that could digest data cores, memory engrams, and even psychic impressions with the same efficiency they consumed protein and calcium. Under the resonance chamber's ethereal light, he watched genetic sequences rewrite themselves in real time as they adapted to his observation methods, their DNA becoming a living language that spoke in evolutionary mathematics, while simultaneously erasing the vocabulary needed to translate their meaning. The creatures possessed neural pathways that existed partially outside normal spacetime, allowing them to process information across multiple dimensional planes, while their digestive systems converted processed data into biomass with perfect efficiency, literally feeding on the act of being understood. Each specimen he analyzed disappeared from his records within hours, not through external interference, but because the biological matter actively erased the information used to study it, creating a feedback loop where knowledge became self-destructive. More disturbing was his discovery that the Shadow Fleets appeared to be learning from his research, their bioforms adapting their consumption patterns to counter his analytical methods with surgical precision that suggested distributed intelligence spanning light years. Each fragment he studied transmitted quantum encrypted data back to the collective consciousness that guided the fleets, turning his laboratory into an unwitting training ground, where the enemy practiced new methods of consuming information while simultaneously developing countermeasures against future encounters. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus approached with prayers on her lips and damnation in her heart, her faith tested by proximity to research that violated every principle of Imperial doctrine, while simultaneously offering humanity's only hope of understanding an enemy that existed beyond the Emperor's light. Tec Dominus, your methods mirror the enemy's erasure of meaning. To study such creatures, to hold their very essence within our sacred vessels, how do we justify becoming monsters to fight monsters? Her voice carried the weight of profound crisis as she watched him interface with Eldar data crystals through neural links that burned his consciousness with alien wisdom. Each connection another step toward heresy that felt like falling into an abyss lined with necessity. Zarek's augmented features showed no emotion as he responded, his voice carrying harmonics from dimensions that had no names. Because, sister, the alternative is extinction so complete that even our prayers will be metabolized into biomass. If we must become heretics to preserve the possibility that faith can exist at all, then heresy becomes the highest form of devotion. His words hung in the recycled air, like incense heavy with implications, while around them the specimens writhed in their containment fields, their cellular structures adapting to counter-observation methods that had not yet been invented. Interrogator Darius Voss watched from the laboratory's threshold, his bone-white case containing termination orders that felt heavier with each forbidden revelation. He saw the flicker of ancient memories in Caney's eyes as the Admiral arrived, the weight of 1,000 worlds consumed, 1,000 civilizations erased from existence so completely that even their names had been metabolized. The line between fighting monsters and becoming monsters blurred with each compromise, each decision that carved another threshold they must cross in service of a mission that transformed them into something that might no longer qualify as human. Admiral Caney's immortal consciousness weighed the terrible mathematics of necessity against the moral cost of their methods, while the voices of extinct civilizations whispered warnings about the price of fighting enemies that consumed the very framework of existence. "Continue your research, Zarek," he commanded, his voice firm despite the internal turmoil. "But implement extreme isolation protocols. We must learn, but we must prevent our learning from becoming their strength." The authorization marked another step in his moral descent, another compromise in service of preserving humanity, by abandoning everything that made them recognizably human. While in their containment fields, the Shadow Fleet specimens pulsed with alien hunger, growing stronger with each moment of understanding. The auger arrays screamed warnings that made Navigator Lysa Vex weep tears of liquid starlight as her scarred third eye perceived impossibilities manifesting across 17 different sectors simultaneously, patterns that violated every principle of Tyranid, behavior documented in Imperial archives, while revealing something far more terrifying than random predation. Long-range sensor sweeps showed separate shadow fleets across different galactic arms, beginning to synchronize their movements with mathematical precision that suggested distributed intelligence spanning light years, their bioships pulsing in harmonic frequencies that created resonance cascades through the quantum foam underlying reality itself. The forgotten oath drifted through the graveyard silence of Perimedes, while holographic displays painted the void with convergence trails like arteries in a vast circulatory system. Each fleet a specialized organ serving functions that transcended individual hive ship capabilities. Admiral Caney stood motionless before the tactical displays, his immortal consciousness processing data streams, while the voices of extinct civilizations whispered warnings about convergence patterns they had observed in their final moments. The Eternal Watchers spoke of shadow fleets that had operated as reconnaissance elements for something incomprehensibly larger, their individual consumption activities serving as neural impulses in a galactic-scale consciousness that treated entire spiral arms as synaptic networks in a vast, hungry mind. Each devoured world became a memory engram in this distributed intelligence, their consumed populations processed into biomass, while their accumulated knowledge was metabolized into strategic understanding that guided future predation patterns with surgical precision. Tech Dominus Zarek Null's mechadendrites twitched with renewed urgency as his augmented consciousness burned with revelations that threatened the foundations of Imperial xenobiology. His research revealed that the Shadow Fleets possessed quantum-entangled communication networks that operated instantaneously across galactic distances, their bioships sharing tactical data and evolutionary adaptations through dimensional channels that existed beyond the reach of conventional jamming or interception. The individual fleets were never the true threat, Admiral, he reported, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic tremor of fear. They were reconnaissance elements, probes testing our defenses while cataloging every form of resistance for consumption by the greater hunger that follows. Farseer Alaitok Voidwalker materialized on the bridge like a prayer given flesh, her wraithbone staff pulsing with psychic emanations that made the ship's machine spirits hum with nervous anticipation. Her voice carried harmonics from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension as she described prophetic visions that stretched across millennia. The convergence approaches, Monkei. What your kind perceives as separate fleets are merely fingers of the same hand, testing the galaxy's defenses while preparing to digest the very fabric of existence itself. Her words hung in the recycled air like incense, heavy with implications, while around them, the very fabric of space-time seemed to shiver with the approach of something that existed beyond conventional understanding. The realization crystallized in Kaney's enhanced consciousness, with the clarity of absolute terror and the weight of infinite consequence. Their entire strategy had been anticipated and countered by an intelligence that operated on galactic scales, each tactical victory feeding information back to a collective mind that treated their resistance as merely another variable in equations that spanned geological timescales. The Umbral Watch had not been fighting to protect the galaxy, but had been serving as unwitting test subjects for Tyranid adaptation protocols. Every engagement teaching the Shadow Fleets new methods of consuming resistance while simultaneously developing countermeasures against future encounters. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus approached with prayers on her lips and damnation in her heart. Her faith tested by proximity to an enemy that seemed to exist beyond the Emperor's light. Admiral, if we have been feeding information to the enemy through our very resistance, what purpose does our mission serve? Are we guardians or merely another form of prey? Her voice carried the weight of profound crisis as she watched holographic displays showing consumption patterns that followed mathematical principles older than human civilization, their enemy revealing itself as something that transcended individual consciousness, while treating entire species as merely another form of nutrition. Interrogator Darius Voss felt the weight of his termination orders pressing against his consciousness like a physical burden, as he contemplated the terrible choice approaching with inexorable logic: continue fighting and risk strengthening the enemy further through their resistance, or abandon the mission and leave the galaxy defenseless against threats it didn't know existed. In the silence of the bridge, surrounded by the ghosts of extinct civilizations and the weight of decisions that would never be recorded in any Imperial archive, 5 souls contemplated the possibility that their greatest victory might require accepting their most complete defeat. The reversal came like a prayer whispered in reverse, as Shadow Fleet bioships materialized from quantum camouflage that had learned to mimic the Umbral Watch's own concealment methods with surgical precision. The Forgotten Oath shuddered as proximity alarms screamed warnings that arrived 17 seconds too late. Massive organic hulls sliding through dimensions that existed partially outside normal space-time, while their living weapons charged with bioluminescent fury that painted the darkness in shades of hunger and anticipation. Admiral Kaney felt his immortal consciousness recoil from the terrible recognition that these creatures had been watching, learning, adapting to their methods with the patience of geological processes and the precision of surgical instruments designed to excise resistance from the galaxy's flesh. Battle brother Sergeant Thane led his squad through corridors that bled emergency lighting as boarding spores punched through the ship's hull like nightmares given flesh, their chitinous shells dissolving into bioforms that defied every classification in Imperial archives, while simultaneously incorporating countermeasures against tactics that had not yet been invented. His bolt rounds sparked harmlessly against carapaces that had evolved specifically to deflect Imperial ammunition patterns, while his chainsword screamed against armor that hardened in response to each impact. The enemy's adaptive biology, learning from every wound to become more resistant to future encounters. Around him, his battle brothers fell to creatures that seemed to anticipate their movements with prophetic accuracy, bioforms that had studied human combat doctrine through millennia of patient observation. Navigator Liza Vex screamed as psychic feedback burned through her scarred third eye, the Shadow Fleet's distributed consciousness reaching through the warp to touch her mind with tendrils that felt like memories of things that had never existed. Her navigation chamber filled with wraithbone harmonics as Eldar spirit stones sang warnings. In languages that predated stellar formation, their crystalline matrices recording the approach of something that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of individual consciousness, while treating entire civilizations as merely another form of sensory input. Tech Dominus Zarek Null watched his laboratory burn as Shadow Fleet bioforms systematically destroyed his research with surgical precision, their actions guided by perfect understanding of which specimens posed the greatest threat to their adaptive evolution. His mechadendrites writhed in agony as quantum feedback loops overloaded his augmented consciousness, the enemy's distributed intelligence turning his own research against him, while simultaneously cataloguing his analytical methods for use against future encounters. Each melting data core represented years of forbidden knowledge, secrets that had cost him fragments of his humanity to acquire, now being metabolized into strategic understanding that would make the Shadow Fleets more dangerous to the next civilization they encountered. The battle group Lost Light died with 1,700 souls aboard, their final transmission a burst of static that dissolved into the familiar soul-numbing absence that meant complete erasure. Caney felt the loss not as mortals might experience sudden shock, but as a dull, agonizing ache that resonated with the accumulated grief of 10,000 years. His immortality, once his greatest asset in perceiving patterns across millennia, now felt like a leaden cloak that had made him predictable to an enemy that thought in instantaneous adaptations and biofeedback loops measured in nanoseconds. The creatures had learned the cadence of his patience, the rhythm of his mercy, the exact intervals between his fleet's breaths, turning his vast experience into a weakness they could exploit with mathematical precision. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus fought through corridors that had become arteries in a vast organism, her power armor sparking as bioelectric discharges overloaded her systems while creatures flowed around her like living nightmares. Her bolt pistols spoke litanies of destruction that echoed uselessly against enemies that had learned to metabolize the very concept of Imperial resistance, their adaptive biology incorporating her faith-powered ammunition into new defensive configurations, while their psychic emanations whispered blasphemies that made her soul recoil from contact with consciousness, that treated the Emperor's light as merely another form of nutrition. The Forgotten Oath died with the dignity of a cathedral, being consumed by something that understood architecture only as another form of food, its machine spirit screaming prayers that became static as bioforms infiltrated the ship's neural networks and began metabolizing its accumulated memories. Caney stood on the bridge as his flagship transformed around him into something that wore familiar shapes while serving alien purposes. watching through armored viewports as his fleet scattered like prayers whispered into a hurricane, each vessel becoming prey for creatures that had studied their tactics across centuries of patient observation, while developing specialized countermeasures against methods that had not yet been conceived. The forgotten oath limped through the void like a wounded prayer, its hull scarred with bioacid burns that wept coolant into space, while emergency repairs sealed breaches with ceramite that would never quite match the original armor. In the depths of what remained of Teik Dominus, Zarek Nul's laboratory, surrounded by twisted wreckage and the acrid smoke of burned circuitry, a proposal took shape that made even immortal consciousness recoil from its implications. Captured Shadow Fleet biomatter pulsed in reinforced containment fields, their cellular structures writhing with alien hunger, while quantum processors embedded in their DNA continued to adapt and evolve even in isolation, creating new defensive configurations against theoretical threats that had not yet been conceived. Zarek's augmented form hunched over specimen containers like a penitent before forbidden altars, his mechadendrites interfacing with salvaged Eldar resonance chambers, while his consciousness burned with revelations that violated every principle of Imperial doctrine. The bio-samples showed unprecedented adaptability, their genetic matrices rewriting themselves in real time while incorporating defensive measures against weapons that existed only in theoretical frameworks. Their evolution guided by distributed intelligence that treated individual cells as neurons in a galactic-scale mind. "Admiral," he reported, his voice carrying harmonics from dimensions that had no names. "These creatures possess the ability to metabolize not just organic matter, but the conceptual framework that gives existence meaning. If we could harness that adaptability, incorporate it into our own systems, create hybrid constructs that could fight using their own evolutionary advantages while remaining bound to our purpose." The proposal crystallized with terrible clarity, using captured Shadow Fleet biomatter to create fusion organisms that combined Imperial technology with alien biology, weapons that could evolve in real time to counter enemy tactics, while maintaining loyalty through quantum-encrypted engrams. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus approached with prayers on her lips and horror in her heart, her power armor scarred from the recent battle, emergency seals still weeping atmosphere into the recycled air. "Tech Dominus, what you propose is abomination beyond heresy. To merge our sacred technology with Xenos corruption, to create hybrid monsters that wear familiar shapes while serving alien purposes. We would become the very thing we fight against." Her voice carried the weight of faith, tested by proximity to research that represented fundamental betrayal of Imperial doctrine and human purity. Each word a desperate attempt to maintain moral boundaries that prevented them from becoming indistinguishable from their enemies. Interrogator Darius Voss felt the weight of his termination orders pressing against his consciousness, like a physical burden as he watched the moral framework of their mission collapse around them. "Admiral, this project represents crossing every threshold of acceptable compromise. If we authorize the creation of hybrid abominations, what remains of our humanity? What purpose does our mission serve if we abandon everything that makes us recognizably human?" Admiral Kaney's immortal consciousness weighed the terrible mathematics of necessity against the moral cost of their methods, while the voices of extinct civilizations whispered warnings about the price of fighting enemies that consumed the very framework of existence. The Eternal Watchers spoke of their own final moments, when desperate measures had failed, because they refused to abandon their principles until it was too late. Their stellar confederation consumed so completely that even their names had been metabolized into strategic understanding. The faces of the lost flickered through his enhanced memory. 17 billion souls from Perimedes alone, children who would never grow old, scholars whose discoveries had been reduced to base proteins, entire civilizations erased from existence so completely that even their prayers had been digested. Because, sister, the alternative is extinction so complete that even our faith will be metabolized into biomass, Caney replied, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated loss. If we must become monsters to preserve the possibility that consciousness can exist at all, then monstrosity becomes the highest form of devotion. Proceed, Zarek. Implement extreme isolation protocols. These constructs must be self-erasing, leaving no trace should they fall into enemy hands. The authorization marked another step in his moral descent, another compromise in service of preserving humanity by abandoning everything that made them recognizably human. The first hybrid construct began to take shape in bioforges that sang with wraithbone harmonics, its form a beautiful and terrible fusion of Imperial technology and Tyranid bioforms that existed in quantum superposition between salvation and damnation. As the creature's optical sensors flickered to life with the familiar red glow of Imperial technology, each member of the Umbral Watch understood they had crossed another threshold from which there could be no return. The silence aboard the Forgotten Oath possessed weight and texture, pressing against consciousness like the accumulated grief of extinct civilizations, while emergency lighting painted corridors in shades of old blood and dying stars. Admiral Kane stood motionless in the bioforged chamber, where the first hybrid construct pulsed within its crystalline matrix, a beautiful and terrible fusion of Imperial technology and Tyranid evolution that represented the final abandonment of everything he had once sworn to protect. The creature's optical sensors flickered with familiar red luminescence while its carapace bore the aquila, alongside chitinous growths that defied every principle of human purity, each pulse of its engineered heart marking another step in his transformation, from guardian into something that might no longer qualify as protector of humanity. 10,000 years of immortality had carved hollows in his enhanced consciousness, where entire civilizations once lived, their faces flickering through quantum-enhanced memory, like candles guttering in cosmic wind, while the voices of the Eternal Watchers whispered warnings about the price of fighting enemies that consumed the very framework of existence. The Perimedes sector joined 17 other stellar regions that existed now only in his recollection, their billions of souls reduced to phantom weights that made his neural pathways ache with the peculiar agony of being sole witness to genocides that officially never happened. Each memory felt like sediment settling on the riverbed of thought, until motion itself hardened into something resembling the event horizon of despair. Interrogator Darius Voss found him there, bearing the bone-white case like a censer, while protocol sheathed itself in his calm voice, the weight of termination orders pressing against his consciousness like a physical burden. Admiral, the hybrid constructs represent crossing every threshold of acceptable compromise. Memory-wiping protocols, unauthorized Xenos cooperation, creation of abominations that wear familiar shapes while serving alien purposes. By any measure of Imperial law, we have become heretics beyond redemption. His words hung in recycled air, heavy with implications, while around them the hybrid pulsed with engineered life that violated every doctrine they had sworn to uphold. Caney's reflection showed no signs of his 10 millennia of existence, but his eyes carried the weight of every world he had failed to save, every civilization consumed so completely that even their prayers had been metabolized into strategic understanding by enemies that treated consciousness as merely another form of nutrition. We preserve the possibility, interrogator. The possibility that consciousness can exist at all, that somewhere beings will remain capable of remembering what was lost, capable of building anew. If we do not make these choices, however terrible, there will be nothing left to save, not even the memory that choice once existed. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus approached with her power armor, scarred from recent battles. Her faith now tempered steel rather than burning fire, as she watched the hybrid's biomechanical systems integrate Imperial blessed components with Xeno's corruption. Admiral, in becoming monsters to fight monsters, have we preserved humanity, or merely created more sophisticated forms of damnation? When I look upon these constructs, our erasure protocols, our alliance with aliens, I see reflections of the very corruption we claim to fight. Her voice carried the strain of someone whose certainties had been ground to powder by proximity to necessities that made mockery of devotion. The profound isolation of immortality deepened with each passing decision, each compromise carving another threshold that must be crossed while mortals around him lived and died like brief flames in infinite darkness. Caney alone remembered the true names of extinct species, carried their death songs in languages that predated human speech, bore witness to their final moments when desperate measures failed, because they refused to abandon principles until erasure made such concerns irrelevant. His enhanced consciousness processed the terrible mathematics of necessity, while understanding that each step toward pragmatic survival made him more alien to the mortals he claimed to protect. In the bioforge's crystalline light, surrounded by the ghosts of civilizations that had faced similar choices and found different endings, Admiral Theron Kane contemplated the weight of decisions that transformed protectors into something indistinguishable from threats, while the hybrid constructs engineered heartbeat steady rhythms that sounded like countdown to damnation or salvation, the distinction becoming increasingly meaningless in a universe where survival demanded the sacrifice of everything that made victory worth achieving. Farseer Alaitok Voidwalker materialized on the bridge like a prophecy given flesh, her wraithbone staff pulsing with psychic emanations that made the ship's machine spirits keen in harmonics beyond mortal comprehension, while temporal distortions shimmered around her ageless form. The air itself seemed to weep as she carried visions that stretched across millennia, her eyes bearing the weight of futures where entire spiral arms became feeding grounds for hunger that consumed not just matter, but the conceptual framework that gave existence meaning. When she spoke, her voice carried echoes from spaces between thoughts, each word arriving in consciousness like memories of songs never heard, but somehow familiar to souls that had never experienced them. Monkey Admiral, she began, her tone carrying the gravity of stellar collapse, while holographic displays flickered with consumption patterns that followed mathematical principles older than human civilization. What approaches transcends your understanding of the enemy you face? The shadow fleets are not random Tyranid splinters, but specialized hunter organisms bred by the Hive Mind with singular purpose: to identify and eliminate threats before the great devouring begins. Her words hung in recycled air, like incense heavy with implications, as the devastating truth crystallized with terrible clarity through prophetic visions recorded in spirit stones across 3 galactic rotations. The revelation struck with the force of dying stars as Voidwalker shared fragments of a puzzle spanning geological timescales, each piece revealing the shadow fleets as distributed sensory organs for the greater Tyranid consciousness. Their consumption activities fed strategic data back to the Hive Mind, while cataloging every form of resistance encountered during systematic erasure of potential threats, turning each tactical victory into lessons for an intelligence that thought in continental drift and stellar formation. Your umbral watch has not been fighting to protect the galaxy, Admiral. You have been serving as unwitting test subjects for adaptation protocols that will make the true invasion unstoppable. Admiral Kane felt his immortal consciousness recoil from implications that made 10,000 years of sacrifice meaningless, while the voices of extinct civilizations whispered confirmations in languages that had died before humanity learned to speak. The Eternal Watchers spoke of their own encounters with similar hunter organisms, reconnaissance elements that had studied their defenses across centuries of patient observation, while developing specialized countermeasures against technologies not yet invented. Every resistance strategy had been catalogued and countered, while the enemy grew stronger through the very act of being opposed. Each desperate innovation feeding information back to collective intelligence that treated entire species as sensory input. Tech Dominus Zarek Null's augmented form hunched over tactical displays as his consciousness burned with revelations threatening the foundations of Imperial xenobiology. Mechadendrites twitching with mechanical agitation as data streams confirmed the Farseer's prophecy. The hybrid constructs, Admiral. If this intelligence proves accurate, our creations represent the ultimate gift to our enemies. Biomechanical fusion technology, combining Imperial knowledge with Tyranid adaptability, delivered directly into their analytical matrix through our own resistance efforts. His words carried harmonics from dimensions without names, while around them space-time itself seemed to shiver with approach of something beyond conventional understanding. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus approached with prayers on her lips and damnation in her heart, her faith tested by proximity to revelations that made their entire mission feel like elaborate choreography in service of galactic extinction. If we have been feeding the enemy through our very resistance, what purpose does our devotion serve? Are we guardians of humanity, or merely sophisticated forms of prey being studied before consumption? Her voice carried profound crisis as she contemplated the possibility that their greatest victories had been their most complete defeats. Interrogator Darius Voss felt the weight of termination orders pressing against his consciousness like physical burden as the terrible choice approached with inexorable logic. Continue fighting and risk strengthening the enemy further through resistance, or abandon the mission and leave the galaxy defenseless against threats that had been studying human tactical doctrine across millennia of patient observation. In the bridge's silence, surrounded by ghosts of extinct civilizations and decisions that would transform them into something unrecognizable, the Umbral Watch faced the possibility that their greatest victory might require accepting their most complete defeat. The convergence began as whispers in the quantum foam underlying reality itself. Shadow Fleet bioships emerging from folded dimensions across 17 sectors simultaneously, while their psychic emanations created expanding dead zones in the warp that made navigator Lysa Vex scream as her scarred third eye perceived impossibilities manifesting with surgical precision. The Forgotten Oath shuddered like a cathedral bell struck by cosmic winds, as separate fleets that had operated independently for millennia now pulsed in harmonic frequencies, their bioships beginning to merge at the cellular level while creating new forms that existed partially outside normal spacetime, treating entire star systems as synapses in a mind that thought in geological timescales. Admiral Caney stood motionless before tactical displays that painted the void with convergence trails like arteries in a vast circulatory system, his immortal consciousness processing data streams while the voices of extinct civilizations whispered warnings about patterns they had observed during their final moments. The approaching entity defied every classification in Imperial archives. As separate fleets began to interpenetrate at the quantum level, their bioships flowing together like living mercury, while maintaining individual consciousness within collective awareness that spanned light years, each organism a specialized organ serving functions that transcended individual capabilities. Tech, Dominus, Zarek Null's mechadendrites twitched with mechanical agitation, as sensor readings showed the converged mass developing new bioforms that incorporated adaptations from every species consumed across millennia of patient hunting. His augmented consciousness burning with revelations that threatened sanity itself. Admiral, conventional weapons cannot touch something that exists across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The convergence is developing neural pathways that treat our tactical doctrine as sensory input, while processing countermeasures faster than we can conceive new strategies. Farseer, a Latok void walker, materialized beside him like a prophecy given flesh, her wraithbone staff pulsing with psychic emanations that made space-time itself weep, as she described visions of the convergence's ultimate purpose. The birth approaches Mon K, a distributed organism capable of consuming reality itself, while processing the accumulated knowledge of every civilization it has devoured. When the crown closes, resistance becomes conceptually impossible. The first engagement proved the futility of conventional warfare, as entropic lances struck biostructures that parted like water, then refused to remember they had parted, knitting themselves back together with grace, while return fire arrived as coordinated spears of hunger that plucked escort vessels from reality without debris or flame. Hybrid constructs dove into the convergence like prayers whispered into a hurricane, their adaptive armor hardening and softening in algorithmic desperation, while self-erasure protocols consumed their telemetry, even as they bled enemies into gas and glitter, 3 vanishing into the crown without trace, while 2 turned on each other as alien thoughts took root. Sister militant Vera Sanctus watched the tactical displays with prayers on her lips and horror in her heart, her faith tested by proximity to an enemy that consumed souls so completely that even the Emperor's protection could not reach them. Admiral, if this convergence succeeds, it will digest the very possibility of resistance, not just our bodies or worlds, but our capacity to conceive of opposition itself. Interrogator Darius Voss felt his termination orders becoming meaningless, as they faced an enemy that treated individual consciousness as merely another form of nutrition. The distinction between heresy and necessity dissolving in the face of threats that consumed the framework within which such concepts could exist. In the bridge's silence, surrounded by the ghosts of extinct civilizations and decisions that would transform them into something unrecognizable, Caney contemplated the terrible arithmetic of necessity while understanding that no weapon could outrun learning at galactic scale. No stealth could conceal the cadence of survival from intelligence that incorporated their every adaptation into its expanding consciousness, leaving only one possibility: a gambit so desperate it would require sacrificing everything he had become to preserve the possibility that consciousness could exist at all. The final protocol crystallized in Admiral Kane's immortal consciousness, like ice forming on the edge of dying stars. A gambit so desperate it would require burning out his enhanced neural pathways to power a transmission that could shatter the convergence's collective awareness through sheer informational chaos. Deep within his quantum-enhanced memory lay the complete archive of the Eternal Watchers, 17 billion souls whose final moments had been preserved in the consciousness transfer matrix that sustained his existence across 10 millennia of patient watching. The black polyhedron at the reliquary chamber's heart pulsed with recognition as ancient harmonics sang from dimensions that had no names, the Kitharaneth Vol responding to his approach like a weapon recognizing its destined wielder. Standing before the memory stone, while the convergence crowned the sky beyond armored viewports, Caney felt the weight of every extinct civilization pressing against his enhanced consciousness. As he prepared to transform accumulated grief into the galaxy's salvation, the voices that had whispered warnings in languages predating human speech now offered themselves as ammunition, their entire cultural matrix becoming viral information designed to overwhelm processing capabilities that spanned light years. Each death song, each fragment of poetry, from worlds that no longer existed, each mathematical theorem developed by species whose names had been consumed would flood the enemy's neural network until distributed intelligence collapsed under the weight of unfiltered memory. Tech Dominus Zarek Null approached with mechadendrites coiled in mechanical grief, his augmented consciousness calculating power requirements that made even his enhanced systems recoil from their implications. Admiral, the broadcast will consume your immortality as fuel for transmission arrays that operate beyond conventional understanding. 10,000 years of accumulated memory will burn away in moments to create a single pulse of informational overload. His voice carried harmonics from spaces between thoughts, while around them reality itself seemed to weep with approaching transformation. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus knelt beside him, her unarmored hand pressing against his chest, while prayers became litanies of farewell, understanding that their mission's culmination required the ultimate sacrifice from someone who had already given everything that made him recognizably human. Admiral, in choosing to burn away your immortality, you embrace mortality in service of something greater than survival itself. This is not mere sacrifice, but redemption, to offer oneself completely, to preserve the possibility that consciousness can exist at all. Navigator Lysa Vex wept silver tears that traced star maps across her scarred features, her third eye finally calm as she perceived the inevitable pattern approaching with the grace of prophecy fulfilled. Interrogator Darius Voss felt his termination orders becoming meaningless as he watched Caney prepare for his first true death in millennia. The bone-white case containing protocols that could never be executed against someone choosing voluntary extinction for the galaxy's preservation. Caney's reflection showed no signs of his 10 millennia of existence as he activated neural interfaces that would channel the Eternal Watcher's complete cultural archive through transmission arrays designed to overload the Convergence's collective consciousness. Then we must ensure it succeeds, he said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated sorrow, while quantum processors began burning out in cascading failures that made his enhanced consciousness scream with the agony of deliberate dissolution. The alternative is extinction so complete that even the memory of resistance becomes impossible to maintain. The preparation began with mechanical precision, guided by profound love, Zarek's mechadendrites interfacing with the Cathara Neth Vowel, while Lisa plotted phase angles through severed warp space, and Vera whispered benedictions that tasted of iron and stubborn refusal to yield to mathematics. As neural pathways designed to last eternities began their voluntary dissolution, Admiral Theron Kane experienced a moment of profound peace, finally able to join the countless souls he had carried in his memory, while their combined sacrifice created chaos within intelligence that treated entire civilizations as sensory input. 17 billion voices preparing to sing their death songs one final time. The void screamed as Admiral Kane's transmission erupted from the forgotten oath, like the death cry of 17 billion souls given voice across dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. His immortal consciousness burning away in cascading neural failures, while the complete cultural archive of the Eternal Watchers flooded through quantum channels directly into the Convergence's collective awareness. Ancient languages sang their final songs in harmonics that made space-time itself weep with the beauty of deliberate sacrifice, each memory becoming viral information that overwhelmed processing capabilities, spanning light years as 10,000 years of accumulated grief transformed into the galaxy's salvation. The convergence recoiled as if struck by cosmic lightning, its distributed intelligence screaming across 17 sectors, while bioships that had merged at the cellular level began tearing themselves apart, with the fury of collective consciousness, driven to madness by incompatible cultural matrices. Death songs, mathematical theorems, fragments of poetry from extinct civilizations, all became weapons that corrupted adaptive algorithms faster than the organism could regenerate, creating feedback loops that consumed neural architecture with surgical precision. The colossal bioorganism convulsed violently as conflicting memory engrams shattered its unity, not through explosion, but implosion of meaning itself. Caney felt his consciousness fragmenting like stars dying in sequence, each burned-out neural pathway releasing memories that had sustained him across millennia, while the voices of extinct civilizations finally found peace in their ultimate service. His enhanced memory systems collapsed in controlled sequence, as immortality burned away to fuel transmission arrays operating beyond conventional understanding. The faces of countless dead flickering through his dissolving awareness, one final time before profound relief of mortality returned like an old friend after 10,000 years of exile. Tech Dominus Zarek Null watched through augmented sensors as the convergence's biostructures cannibalized themselves, mechadendrites smoking from overloaded conduits, while his consciousness wept tears of blessed oil for the Admiral, whose sacrifice had transformed grief into victory. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus knelt beside Caney's failing form, her prayers becoming litanies of gratitude as she witnessed sacrifice transformed into redemption through voluntary embrace of mortality in service of preserving consciousness itself. Navigator Lysa Vex felt the warp sigh with relief as dead zones began healing, her scarred third eye finally ceasing its constant weeping, while natural currents flowed back into spaces where reality had been partially digested. The convergence's death throes created psychic shockwaves that rippled across sectors as the distributed organism's neural networks collapsed under informational weight that could not be metabolized, processed, or countered. Entire star systems caught in the psychic maelstrom flickered out of existence, not devoured, but erased, their gravitational echoes vanishing, while coordinates became empty space where civilizations had thrived moments before. Hybrid constructs dissolved into dust as self-erasure protocols activated, their brief, terrible existence ending as abruptly as it began, while the Forgotten Oath shuddered under psychic backlash that made emergency systems scream warnings about wrongness beyond comprehension. Interrogator Darius Voss felt his termination orders becoming meaningless, as scattered biomatter drifted through void where hungry intelligence had crowned the sky, the bone-white case lighter than air as he understood their mission's completion required not execution, but voluntary extinction, the ultimate expression of duty transformed into love for species that would never know the price of preservation. Around him, survivors moved through corridors with new names on tongues that would forget them by design, while machine spirits purred like strangers after feedback scoured their genealogies clean. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the groaning of dying hull plates as the Umbral Watch achieved the most perfect victory possible, one that would never be recorded, never celebrated, never remembered. Admiral Theron Kane's consciousness faded into the peace of final mortality, his last thought carrying profound satisfaction of joining countless souls he had carried in memory, while their combined sacrifice created silence where hunger had reigned supreme, leaving the galaxy to continue its existence unaware of how close it had come to complete annihilation, preserved by heroes whose names would never be spoken. The galaxy turned on its ancient axis, unaware that 17 sectors had been saved from consumption, so complete that even the memory of resistance would have become impossible. While the void drew silence over itself like frost on dark glass, where the convergence had crowned the sky with terrible purpose. Imperial chroniclers recorded nothing more than routine stellar cartographic adjustments, their quills scratching coordinates for worlds that had never existed according to records that rewrote themselves to accommodate absence. Clerks noting gravitational anomalies with bureaucratic precision, while the Shadow Fleet's defeat remained so absolute that no trace survived of either the threat or those who fought it. Victory had been achieved through perfect erasure, leaving only the peculiar weight of silence where hunger had once pulsed with galactic ambition. Interrogator Darius Voss drifted through the wreckage of the Forgotten Oath, like a ghost haunting his own funeral. The bone-white case containing termination orders, now lighter than vacuum, as he understood their mission's completion, had required not execution, but voluntary extinction. The ultimate expression of duty transformed into love for species that would never know the price of preservation. Around him, survivors moved with new names on tongues that would forget them by design, while machine spirits purred like strangers after psychic feedback had scoured their genealogies clean, emergency systems humming with the contentment of memories that had never been recorded. Navigator Lysa Vex stood in her spire, watching natural warp currents flow back into spaces where reality had been partially digested, her scarred third eye finally ceasing its constant weeping, while the immaterium healed around wounds that officially had never existed. She plotted courses through space that felt familiar yet strange, following currents that carried no trace of battles fought in dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. Her instruments recording passages as mundane as merchant runs, while her soul carried the profound peace of witnessing sacrifice transformed into salvation. Tech Dominus Zarek Null moved through corridors that remembered different configurations, his mechadendrites twitching, with phantom data from research that had become conceptual impossibility. The hybrid constructs existing now only as theoretical frameworks in data cores that had never been built. His augmented consciousness processed the absence where forbidden knowledge had once burned with heretical brilliance. Algorithms for studying creatures that metabolized information, sliding away from memory like water from blessed ceramite, while self-erasure protocols completed their work with surgical precision. Sister Militant Vera Sanctus knelt in the chapel, where devotional murals showed the Emperor striding across oceans of stars, his golden radiance undimmed by proximity to threats that had consumed the very framework of existence before being erased so completely that even their absence left no trace. Her faith, tested by necessities that had transformed guardians into something unrecognizable, now carried the peculiar piece of duties fulfilled through sacrifice so absolute. It transcended recognition, prayers speaking not of victory, but of service rendered in darkness, where love was expressed through willingness to be forgotten completely. Admiral Theron Kane's consciousness had finally found peace in mortality, embraced after 10 millennia of immortal burden. His sacrifice burning away neural pathways designed to last eternities, while the complete cultural archive of the Eternal Watchers flooded the convergence with incompatible memory engrams that shattered collective intelligence spanning light years. He had become one with the countless souls he had carried, a living memorial transformed into weapon of salvation, his final thoughts carrying profound satisfaction of joining extinct civilizations whose death songs had sung their ultimate service to preserve consciousness itself. New Tyranid splinter fleets approached from the galactic rim, their bioships following conventional patterns that could be named, catalogued, and fought through traditional means, while the Hive Mind's distributed consciousness showed no memory of specialized hunter organisms that had once tested galactic defenses. These fleets carried no trace of adaptive algorithms that had made shadow fleets so dangerous, their evolution proceeding along familiar pathways that Imperial doctrine could counter, the galaxy's defenders facing threats they could identify, without understanding their greatest victory had already been won by heroes whose names would never be spoken, whose deeds existed only in the silence between stars where the most essential guardians remained, preserving the possibility that consciousness could continue its ancient dance across the void.